All right, hello, welcome guys. This is our Chapter 8 video on aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Uh, I'm kind of hiding from my 3-year-old. Every time I try to record this video, he comes and harasses me and I have to stop it. So I'm hiding out on my front porch swing. Wish me luck. Aggregate demand and aggregate supply are like total demand and total supply in the economy, as I think we've introduced before. This is different from supply and demand in individual markets in some ways, but also similar in some ways. So aggregate demand, remember, you can think of as like total spending by consumers or households, businesses, governments, and net exports. Aggregate supply is basically like real GDP or total output, how much stuff our economy is producing. So this is the model that economists use really to analyze changes in the overall economy and whether it's growing or not. So in this video, I'm going to kind of walk through some of the basic concepts and then some of the graphs that I think are a little bit tricky to understand in the book. So hopefully this is helpful. This will probably come in 2 sections of the video as well. Okay, so this is showing you our basic model of aggregate demand, short run and long run aggregate supply. So the first thing to understand here is that long run aggregate supply is that vertical green line in the middle. It's vertical because it is fixed at a certain level of real GDP, and that level of real GDP is what's called the potential output of the economy. It's the potential output because it's the potential that our economy can produce if all of our factors of production are fully employed. So all our people who want a job are working, our capital, our natural resources are all fully employed. In the short run, you can actually go beyond that. We'll talk about that shortly. So that's why the short run aggregate supply curve has a positive slope. But in the long run, our potential output is really fixed at that level of full employment of our natural resources. So that same concept also, the idea of potential output, is also the level of full employment, meaning everyone who wants a job has a job. The unemployment rate is around 4 or 5%, because remember, there's always a little bit of structural and frictional unemployment, but there's zero cyclical unemployment. So that's what's meant by full employment, or the natural level of employment, or the natural level of unemployment. So all those really mean the same thing. Or this also means that we are on the PPC curve because our resources are fully employed. So all those kind of mean the same thing, basically. So aggregate demand has a downward slope, just like a regular demand curve, although it's for different reasons. I'm not going to explain those here. Be sure you look at those in the book. It talks about the wealth effect, the interest rate effect, and the foreign trade effect. So those are the reasons for the negative slope of the aggregate demand curve. You should understand that. But what these graphs are showing you are just increasing and decreasing shifts of the demand curve, which are caused by changes in overall spending. So here is a complete list. Remember that aggregate demand is made up of the sum of 4 expenditures. The expenditures of consumption or households, investment, which is really investment by businesses mainly, government purchases, and net exports. So here's kind of a more complete list of the things that can shift aggregate demand. I'm not going to go through them one by one, but just understand that changes in any of these levels of spending will change aggregate demand and shift that curve. The multiplier effect. So when there is a change in aggregate demand, there's this thing called the multiplier effect, which makes that effect even bigger. So basically, the reason for the multiplier effect is if there's an increase in spending, say the government spends money or consumers start spending more money, every dollar that gets spent becomes income to somebody else, additional income that they wouldn't have had before. So out of that income, they're going to take a portion of it and go spend it as well. And then that becomes income to somebody else. So they'll go out and spend a portion of that as well. So any initial injection of money, total spending, gets multiplied through this effect of kind of being spent and respent over and over again. So that's the multiplier effect. There's a very simple equation for it, which I'll let you look up in the book. It's basically just a ratio, but that's the understanding of it. That's the concept. So now we move on to short-run aggregate supply. So as I said before, it has a positive slope. So it's a little tricky, a little confusing, I think. But if you start at point B, assume we're at equilibrium at point B, and there's an increase in total spending for one of the reasons like we just looked at. So aggregate demand shifts out to the right to AD2. Well, if that's going to put upward pressure on prices. So that's your y-axis here is the average price level. And as those prices go up, businesses are earning more money for the products that they sell. The assumption here, and it's pretty realistic, is that some prices aren't going to go up. So some businesses will have a case where their price that they get for their product goes up, but they might have, for example, a union contract with their workers that locks in their wages, so they don't have to increase wages for a couple of years. Maybe they have contracts or deals with suppliers where their prices are locked in. So a lot of businesses will have this case where some of their cost of production remain low while their prices for what they sell increase. So they're going to become more profitable, which will induce them to work harder and produce more. So that's why in the short run, an increase in the price level can lead to an increase in real GDP. In the long run, however, all these prices will adjust, including wages and input prices and things like that, and we'll just move back over to the long run aggregate supply curve. Actually, the short run aggregate supply will shift back to put us at a new equilibrium on the long run aggregate supply. Because remember, in the long run, aggregate supply is fixed at the level of full employment or potential output. So hopefully that made sense. I know it's kind of tricky, but that's the idea there. That's the reason for the positive slope of the short run aggregate supply curve. Just like with demand, there are shifts. The curve itself can shift. Short run aggregate supply can decrease. That means it moves to the left. Increase moves to the right. Here is a list of reasons for that. So the shifters of short run aggregate supply are these. Again, I won't go through them, but here's the complete list. Shifters of aggregate demand on the left, short run aggregate supply on the right. I will remind you too that anything that shifts short run aggregate supply, if that change remains in place and is permanent, it can shift long run aggregate supply as well. So anyway, this list is included in your study guide. It's also included in there's an exercise you're going to have to do where you have to use it. Exercise 8.1 uses aggregate demand and aggregate supply, but this list is in there. Refer to it. It's very important. Okay, so now we move on to look at graphs like this. So this is showing you on the left supply and demand in the labor market. So in the labor market, the demanders of labor are businesses and government, people who hire workers. The suppliers of labor are workers providing their labor. So it's a little bit different. And the price on the vertical axis there, WE, is the wage rate, average wage rate. So all this graph is really trying to show you is that notice that the wage rate it talks about is a real wage. That means it's inflation adjusted. So what that means is if your wages go up by 5%, but the prices of everything else in the economy go up by 5%, your real wage hasn't changed. You don't have any more purchasing power. So in order for the real wage to go up, that means that average wage levels go up more than price levels. So what this is showing you is that there are many price levels on the graph on the right. That's long run aggregate supply. So P1, P2, P3, P4. Those are many different price levels, which can all leave us at the same level of real GDP. What does that really mean? Example of that would be if the price level goes from P1 to P2 to P3, but the real wage goes up accordingly and keeps up with it. Sorry, nominal wages go up accordingly and keep up with the price level. If they move up together, then the real wage hasn't changed and our potential output hasn't changed. So that's, again, kind of the relationship between the labor market and the long run aggregate supply curve. Okay, I think I'm approaching the